Hello, everyone. Welcome today to our first webinar in this New Perspectives on Park Partnerships webinar series for 2020. Today's webinar is on leading trends in city park partnerships. My name is Rachel Ann Chishin. I'm a project manager for the national network here at Park People, and I'm pleased to be your moderator for today's webinar. So just a few notes to start with. If you're having any technical issues or any trouble hearing or seeing the presentation or slideshow, you can let us know by using the chat function, which is an icon that appears on the bottom of your Zoom window. If you move your mouse over the window, you should see a chat there. We're going to have a couple of pauses, one partway through and at the end for questions and discussion. So if you could please save your questions regarding the webinar content for those points, that would be great. And at those points, we're going to be using the Q&A function to participate in questions. You'll have the option of asking questions there, upvoting other questions, commenting. So we're going to be using the Q&A function for that. We definitely want to encourage participation and interaction, so feel free to pop in with questions there. We also have Stephanie Stanov, a project coordinator with Park People on the line, who's monitoring our online presentation. So yeah, we encourage you to ask questions during our discussion periods, and we'd love to hear from you. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on Park People's website for future reference. For city park staff and other park professionals, we're thrilled to be able to now offer this webinar as a learning credit for the Canadian Parks and Recreation Association's Professional Development Certification Program. If you have any questions around that, please do be in touch. So just to start things off, it would be great to see who's joining us in the webinar today. You can use the chat window and chat to all panelists and attendees and let us know where in the country you're joining us today. It would be great to know who we have on the line. So we have about 100 attendees, and right now we're ranging from Halifax, welcome, Kingston, Clarington, Toronto, Burlington, Calgary, Montreal, bienvenue. That's great. We have so many people here. It's wonderful to see everybody. Guelph, perfect, beautiful, thank you. So just a little introduction to Park People. Park People helps people activate the power of parks to improve the quality of life in cities across Canada. Our national network program provides comprehensive support to grassroots community groups, nonprofit organizations, and municipal staff across the country who are working to animate and enhance their local parks. Programs like this webinar series aim to provide communities with the tools and inspiration they need to animate and improve their city parks, to facilitate information exchange and peer learning between Canadians, as well as to bring innovative city park ideas and projects to life through new partnership and research. We're coming together virtually here today under unprecedented circumstances. So we really want to thank you for all you're doing to keep yourselves and your community safe and healthy in these times. During this situation, we've seen such an appreciation for using and loving our parks like never before. And with so much interest in our parks, we thought that this conversation around bringing partners together in parks would be very timely. So I'm pleased to introduce our panelists today. We have Dave Harvey and Jake Tobin-Garrett. Dave has decades of experience working in government on municipal and environmental issues. He excels at bringing partners together and strategic thinking to overcome complex challenges. He's passionate about community involvement in parks, which is why he founded Park People in 2011. Jake leads Park People's research, policy development, and community engagement work. This includes writing Park People's research reports, including the first ever Canadian City Parks Report, leading community engagement, and managing projects. So I'll pass it over to Jake.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us from so many different places across Canada, and I even saw someone there from New York. So just a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the what and why of partnerships, go into a little bit of the Canadian context and some of the trends that we're seeing, talk a little bit about the scale of different partnerships that we see across the country, and end on a bit of a discussion about challenges and opportunities. So what do we mean by partnerships? Here we're talking about an ongoing relationship versus a kind of one-time relationship. So we're not talking about one-off event partnerships and sponsorships here. We're talking about park partnerships that build kind of an ongoing relationship with an outside organization or a group, usually a nonprofit. And it's important to kind of remember that these can also exist outside of formal kind of quote unquote park areas. So we're seeing, increasing partnerships in, plazas and community housing, green spaces and hydro corridors and places like that. Partnerships involve, obviously some level of shared responsibility and role between a partner and a city, but that can be highly context dependent and flexible. It could be, programming or design, could be community engagement, natural stewardship. Really, the important thing to remember is that good partnerships build on the strengths of each partner and what they can uniquely bring to the table. And lastly, but very importantly, they can exist on a scale of informal to formal. So they may involve, something like a signed agreement or a memorandum of understanding between the partner and the city, but they may be something much more informal, a group of residents or kind of a handshake agreement, something like that. So we're going to go a little bit more into that scale later and provide some specific examples. So how do we at Park People actually support park partnerships? These are a few of the ways we do that. We use our Canada-wide park group network, which I hope and assume a lot of you are part of, connecting residents and nonprofits and funders and city staff across the country. We provide shared learning opportunities, webinars like this, but also in-person events, trying to create opportunities for people to learn from other groups. And we provide some grants and funding as well that can be accessed by groups at different levels, and you can check out our website to learn about those. We also do a lot of best practice and case study research. We want to ensure that we are looking at made in Canada models and that we're learning from groups in Canada as opposed to in the US, where there's a fairly different context, as Dave will get into. And we keep up on the trends and the challenges facing Canadian parks through our Canadian City Parks report. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, but the next one comes out this summer. And we do fee-for-service work as well that we'll highlight a little bit later on, that centers around helping people establish partnerships.
Hi, everyone. And Jake and I are going to sort of go back and forth a little bit, sort of tag team along. So there's just a whole range of reasons why partnerships make great sense, not only from a city parks department perspective, but also from community, business, funders. The most important reason is partnerships build this connection to community. They can help focus energy, unleash creativity, recruit volunteers by providing some kind of central voice for the park. And partnerships can also help deliver locally relevant, responsive programming. And with fundraising, I purposely did not put fundraising at the top there because sometimes city parks departments can be a little too narrowly focused on trying to raise funds, and they miss some of the other benefits that partnerships can bring. But very clearly, obviously, partnerships can bring lots of flexibility and access to different kinds of funding, such as grants, sponsorships, and a bunch of other things. Partnerships can also help support planning and design work and capital campaigns. Obviously, it's far better to have a long-term engaged, thoughtful park group or NGO or some kind of entity related with the park that's part of that park design conversation, rather than just like a one-off traditional community town hall kind of meeting. And lastly, partnerships can really provide some kind of additional or specialized maintenance or operational services. Just overall, partnerships just bring more people to the parks table. As we all know, it's the more allies, friends, partners, and advocates you can have on your side, the better. So that's one of the #1 reasons about bringing partners to the table. I'm just going to spend a bit of time here looking at some of the difference between Canada and the US. Jake mentioned that earlier. And there's definitely some exceptions, and going to be talking a lot about generalities here, but by and large, large partnerships are newer in Canada and far less developed than those in the US. And there's a range of reasons for this. US cities are often older, they're historically more dense. There's a stronger tradition of philanthropy, more supportive tax rules for philanthropy traditionally. But most importantly, almost every US city went through a really incredible decline, particularly in their downtowns in the 1960s and 70s. And there was many cases, whole-scale abandonment of city parks. Great parks began to fall apart. City parks departments really didn't have the resources to properly operate and maintain them. And one of the classic examples that I've pictured here is New York Central Park. You've got the the great lawn on the right side of the picture there, which was, basically a bunch of dead grass. That's one of the buildings from the Harlem Sea up there. And, but many other cities went through all these challenges too. Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Buffalo, almost, right across the US. And for many cases, parks departments literally almost totally shut down. And then, Central Park today, obviously it's this incredible park. And a big reason for that was the creation of the Central Park Conservancy back in 1980. And it was a huge spark for rejuvenating the park. And it's raised over, well over $1 billion with an endowment of hundreds of millions of dollars. And the Conservancy, generally takes about, it runs about 90% of the park, operates it, raises the money for elements around the park. And it's just been this inspiration for the Conservancy movement right across the US. And basically almost every US city has a number of different park conservancies in it. But things have gone in the US just to a whole new level there. It's not just about trying to maintain and support existing parks anymore. We're now seeing very large scale new parks that are entirely paid for with private funds and operated by nonprofits. This is a picture here of Gathering Place in Tulsa. I was there about a year ago. It's an incredible new park. And it was supported by a $500 million grant from one person in Tulsa, who also gave another $100 million for a maintenance endowment. There's not 10 cents of public money that went into the park. Just in comparison, so you've got a $600 million park that went in. The entire capital budget for Tulsa is $22 million, and their operating budget is $20 million. So it's just huge scale philanthropy. Just jumping to the next slide. This is a proposed park in Dallas, the Trinity Park, and they're looking at trying to raise $1 billion for this. Again, with not 10 cents of public dollars going into it. And these are great parks and really great projects, but I think we'd really agree this isn't the kind of model we want to bring to Canada. So why haven't we had these sort of kind of significant conservancies and partnerships in Canada? And again, I'm going to talk a lot of generalities here, but again, by and large, the picture's kind of true. In many terms, we had better urban planning. We had support for keeping our downtowns vital. But most fundamentally, we've always had and continue to have pretty decently funded city park budgets. And the public's expectation and the expectation they put on their city councils is that city governments are going to build, operate, and maintain quality parks in every neighborhood right across the city. It doesn't mean we haven't had partnerships in Canada at various scales, mostly on a much smaller scale. Community's been involved in many different cities, in many different parks for many decades. A really neat model that got out in Alberta is things like the Edmonton's Community Leagues, the Calgary Community Associations, and for almost 100 years, they've been involved in partnerships around working with the city to build and program, smaller scale neighborhood parks. But in simple terms, partnerships have generally been the exception more than the rule in Canada. Another major difference between Canada and the US is that, and that really affects a lot of park partnerships in Canada, is there's this tradition of being, very concerned about the corporatization and privatization of public space. And this is a takeoff of a park sign in Toronto with Coca-Cola Park on it. No, this does not exist in Canada. But jumping to the next one, it does exist in the US. So it's, there's just less concern over this in the US. A number of different cities have sold corporate naming rights for their parks and allow the private sector to build and operate, what should be traditionally public parks. This is a brand new, it's a great park right in downtown Detroit, DTE Park. And, DTE's a power company and they built the park and a nonprofit operates it. And I remember being at this parks conference in the US and talking to a bunch of Americans about this difference between Canada and the US around private nonprofit involvement. And it really sort of came down to this, it's a generalization, but we see it in COVID too, where there's this distrust in the US of government. And there's this sort of feeling that they almost don't trust government to do a great job of taking care of their parks. And they have actually, in many cases, more trust in the private sector or nonprofit to do that. Whereas in Canada, we've kind of got the opposite. It's up to the nonprofit or private sector to show that they can do a good job of this. And the public still, thankfully, for many good reasons, kind of careful about some of these relationships. And another big difference in Canada is that, we've generally been more concerned about an equitable park system, having a good parks right across the whole city. With this, big reliance on partnerships and conservancies in the US, it's really led to a situation of some fantastic parks in certain neighborhoods and horrible ones in others. There's been some focus in the US in the last few years about trying to address this, but some of the differences can be staggering. This is Chicago, and Millennium Park on the right there is just, this incredible park, but a couple of miles away, this other park in the south side of Chicago is just an absolute mess. And these are parks in Chicago. So again, just haven't seen these kind of stark differences in Canada versus the US. And for a few reasons, and Jake's going to cover this off next, but we're just starting to see a lot more of these larger scale developments happen in Canada in recent years. We're going to talk about some examples and models in a few minutes, but just wanted to mention two interesting notable ones here in Canada. The one on the left there is the Meadowway in Toronto. It's an incredible 16-kilometer long linear park project that was kickstarted with $25 million in support from the Weston Foundation. And on the right there, it's the Rotary Mattamy Greenway in Calgary. It's a 138-kilometer long cycling trail with funding from government, but also $5 million from the local Rotary clubs and $5 million from Mattamy Homes.
So yeah, now that we've learned a little bit about kind of the US context and development of partnerships, we're going to talk a little bit about current trends in Canadian park partnerships. And really in Canada, we're seeing kind of increasing interest in partnerships as kind of various and multiple pressures on park systems and park departments have grown over the last number of years. We've seen in the last kind of 5 years park plans and strategies, including discussions about kind of increasing partnerships and looking at alternative governance models, but in those same plans kind of pretty light on policies and actions or details on how to go about doing that. The pressures that we see on park systems really are stemming from things like population growth, from demographic change, from climate change impacts and extreme weather damage, and increasingly tight operating budgets. So cities are seeing kind of higher use of parks by more people, which is putting kind of demand on these parks for different types of parks amenities and kind of higher quality materials. And this in turn is putting pressure on kind of maintenance and operational budgets for those parks. And the nature of how we're using parks in Canada is also changing. Cities are seeing more demand for unstructured uses and different types of programming as people kind of use parks more as sort of outdoor living rooms to hang out in, as opposed to primarily places for kind of sports and recreation. So we're seeing a lot of increase in community gatherings and things like movie nights, in outdoor yoga, and some cities just aren't really set up right now to meet those types of programming needs in parks. And lastly, cities have reported to us kind of a growing desire from community members to get involved in their parks. So this could be through more demand for volunteer opportunities, so kind of maybe stewardship programs where you're doing invasive pulling and things like that, but also a growing desire for more long-term involvement, like the creation of community park groups or something similar. So we wanted to also share some findings from our Canadian City Parks report, which I mentioned before. This is a report on the trends, challenges, and leading practices in city parks. Last year in 2019, we had 23 cities represented from across the country, and this year we have about 27. And the numbers that I'm sharing here are mostly from the 2019 report. So data from the 2019 Canadian City Parks report showed that kind of most participating cities had developed some kind of park partnership. So about 3/4 had developed a park partnership of some kind with a nonprofit, and that many of these partnerships were really focused heavily on programming and activation, which isn't surprising given the increase in demand that we've seen across the country in different cities for diverse and different kinds of programming. About half of the cities in the Canadian City Parks report in 2019 had some kind of formalized program for residents to get involved in parks. So many of these were things like adopt a park style programs, that maybe offer kind of simple opportunities for people to get involved, like through cleanups or stewardship. And it'll be interesting, I think, for us to see kind of how these groups, or if these groups kind of evolve over time and take on a deeper role in the park beyond things like cleanups and stewardship. We've certainly seen that happen in community park groups over the years, as their capacity builds and they look to take on kind of different roles in the park. So for 2020, we're still crunching the numbers for the 2020 Canadian City Parks Report, which should come out sometime this summer. But it is interesting to note right now that private investment in parks, so things like sponsorships and philanthropy, was the only trend that multiple cities said was either decreasing or staying the same, with very few cities in Canada that we have in the report saying that it was increasing. This isn't a direct indicator of partnerships. They're more than just about, private revenue. But it is interesting given how many recent plans and strategies across the country note that, alternative revenue sources or governance models should be a focus of their work, that this is kind of being flat or kind of decreasing. And then lastly, we found in our research that cities like Quebec City and Montreal really have long established formalized park partnerships at multiple scales. And we'll talk about those different scales in a minute. And I think there's lots to learn here from the rest of the country, from what is happening in Quebec. There's lots of community partnerships and nonprofit partnerships in local neighborhoods. Montreal's Green Alleyway program is one that comes to mind at the local level. But there's also larger partnerships to manage and operate key parks in these cities. So the river systems in Quebec City, for instance, and Montreal Park in Montreal. And we're going to highlight a couple of those kind of Quebec examples a little bit later. So we wanted to kind of take this midpoint here to jump into the Q&A. We're going to save most of the time, I think, for the discussion kind of at the end, because we've got a couple more slides to get through, like the model scale and some examples. But if people have questions on what we've talked about so far, you want to share something from your own experience that resonates from what we've been saying, please drop that into the Q&A window using the little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. It has like 2 chat bubbles there, and then we can kind of field some of those questions that are in there.
And I just want to add to one of Jake's points, particularly around some of the pressure some of the cities are facing in terms of with new philanthropy coming into parks and a bit of a decline that was noted in the parks report that will be coming out later this year. That information came in pre-COVID. So, and again, well, we're expecting some additional pressures on the fundraising front around there after COVID and the likely recession.
Absolutely, yeah. It'll be interesting to see in the next Canadian City Parks Report in 2021 a kind of discussion about the impacts of COVID on parks departments and their operations. Carolyn Martin asks, what is the difference between parks and trails?
And Carolyn, would that be about sort of the partnerships around it? Because certainly, again, I raised some examples about some capital philanthropic support for different trail systems that we had there. But certainly in terms of sort of more natural trails, there's a lot of interesting partnerships around stewardship groups. There's a great model in Toronto that's around off-road biking, and that is a great partnership where the cyclists do a lot of the maintenance on the trails and support on the trails in partnership with the city. So, I think trails and parks we see sort of similar types of partnerships out there.
The only thing I would add to that maybe is that sometimes with trails that might be regional in scope, you might have more kind of regional focused partnerships where it might be multiple different municipalities partnering together on that trail and bringing together different groups from different regions. Whereas with a park partnership is kind of more localized depending on the size of that park. Judy, I answered that one. Okay. Let's see, Judy asks here, do you anticipate reduced funding for parks in the city budgets in the next few years due to COVID-19? If so, what suggestions do you have for us to advocate for maintenance of park funding?
I'm just going to jump in there, and we're going to talk about this later on. But again, so this is all, what we're talking about today is partnerships, and it's bringing in new and additional ways to support the city parks departments. But Again, in no way, shape, or form are the partnerships we're talking about designed to replace what the city should be doing. And again, that point Brent brought up earlier about why partnerships, bringing in community groups, supporting park friends groups, bringing in funders, business communities to augment parks. It actually builds a bit of a coalition and a base to actually go forward and support the Parks Department at City Hall. So that's what we found in many of the cities where park people is doing a lot of our work. So they can actually help support this coalition to keep it up so that, it's not about replacing what the city needs to be doing. And I think a positive sign we've seen out of COVID too is, I'm sure we're seeing it, everyone's seeing it in their own city. Like parks have been loved and appreciated like never before. So, it's going to be tight out there for all governments in the next few years, but hopefully we're going to see this real continued push for the importance of parks.
Maybe we'll do one more here at this point, and then, as I mentioned, we have another little bit of the presentation, and then we'll keep these questions open here, and we'll get to them at the end. So Mary at the top there asks, when area residents get involved in their local parks, do proprietary views emerge?
And I'm wondering if that's getting to a point, and we're going to talk about some of the different models with, park friends groups. And if it's getting there to about like, it's more, it's a group of people who are more focused on single issues, or, it's a small group of people who are more interested in their own view of what should happen in the park rather than a broader community view. That can happen. It's something we struggle with the park people, and we try to really work with local groups to make sure that they're actually inclusive, representative of the broader community, try to give different tactics that they can use so that they're bringing in all voices to speak for the park, and it's not a very narrow group of people on it. So it's part of those challenges with any partnership. It is a partnership. These ultimately, at the end of the day, these are all city-owned and operated parks. That's their mandate, is to make sure they're open and accessible to everybody, and any kind of partnership needs to reflect that open and inclusive nature of those partnerships.
Okay. Dave, do you want to do any more of these now, or should we wait until the
Let's hang on to them to the end. How about that?
Okay, great. So we're going to leave those ones open.
We won't lose them. So.
Yeah, these are great questions though. Okay. Some of them may be answered in the next couple of slides perhaps, or this might bring up some more questions for people. So yeah, now we want to get just kind of a little bit deeper, and we want to talk about the different models of partnerships that are out there, and provide some kind of real world Canadian examples of different partners on this scale. And I think often when people are thinking about park partnerships, they jump straight to the Conservancy model, because that's kind of what we see most in the media, and certainly a lot of the big partnerships in the States use this model. But it's important to remember that park partnerships operate on a scale of kind of informal to formal. And lots of partnerships may actually be kind of a blend of these different models. But the key takeaway from this is that there are these different levels of formality in partnerships, from, as I mentioned, kind of handshake agreements to more contractual relationships. And then partnerships may also evolve along this scale as well. Things are rarely static. Groups may start off at one point and kind of, build to another point. So we're going to go through each of these and their main points, and then we're going to provide some examples throughout Canada to kind of make some of these a little bit more real.
Yeah, and we were talking about just this right now about the Park Friends group model. So, these are in every Canadian city at one level or another. This is one of my favorite park groups out there. It's the Park Avenue Community Oven. They're in Dartmouth, and they support gardening and a bake oven in the park. And one of my favorite stories with them is that the hurricane that hit Nova Scotia last year knocked the power out for the whole province. And the community got together, sparked up the bake oven, and in a few hours they were feeding 200 people. So it's a great group. These kind of Park Friends groups are very informal, volunteer-led groups, providing occasional programming, generally limited fundraising potential, but it's really about the volunteer power, the taking ownership of the parks, working with the Parks Department around these things. But ultimately, we find with park people, to be successful, these groups, really need some kind of level of support from the city or from some kind of a network. Park people is active in many of these cities. If the cities can give them breaks on permit fees, trying to somehow make their life easier and support them in different ways. They're all volunteers. They're all just trying to do this in their spare time. Little bits of grants make a huge difference for them. And again, part of the help of having this network and a bit of support from the city, there can be a high level of turnout. It's these kind of high level energy volunteers, hard to keep them sustained, or somebody moves away and it's hard to keep them going. But they just make incredible things happen in parks right across Canada. And again, one of these differences between the US and Canada is that, again, these groups are very active in the US, but generally they're far more organized, more formalized, and very focused on fundraising. Most of those down there are charities that are raising significant dollars for local parks. Whereas here, generally, they're not incorporated. It's just a bunch of well-meaning people who get together and try to make good things happen in their local park. Another model we see in almost every Canadian city in some way, shape, or form is this leaser model. It's where a nonprofit partner comes in and operates from a city-owned park structure, provides services in that park, such as programming, stewardship, arts programming. Often they get some kind of subsidized rent or free rent to use the building. In this case, we highlight here, it's a High Park Nature in High Park in Toronto. Really great group that's been around for a long time doing nature programming for children in the park. And they've recently moved into this heritage building in the picture there. And they're partnering with the city to try to fundraise to make improvements to the building there.
So kind of next up on that formality scale we talked about are these collaborative management models. And these include usually more of a formal agreement of some kind with the city for a partner to undertake some kind of activities in the park. A lot of the time it is programming, while other responsibilities still lie with the city. And sometimes they even share staff members between different organizations. So often this partner will engage in some kind of fundraising and revenue generation perhaps, but they still receive core operational support from the city for their activities. And Les Amis de la Montagne in Montreal is a great example of this. It started off as an advocacy organization in 1986 and kind of evolved into the nonprofit that it is today with a kind of multi-million-dollar budget that partners with the city to deliver things like programming and education and recreational opportunities in the park. And they do raise money through fundraising and kind of revenue from things like on-site rentals and different services and some of the buildings that they operate in the park. But the city does support with that operational funding. And then Quebec City also, as I mentioned, has a long history of using these types of collaborative management models with nonprofit partners assisting in the operation of the riverfront parks, like the St. Charles River Society. So we have deep dive case studies available on our website of both of these, Les Amis de la Montagne and the St. Charles River Society on our website. So I think those links will be dropped into the chat. So if you want to go a little bit deeper on these models, you can kind of read up on all the intricacies of them there. And lastly, on the formality scale, we have sort of sole manager models. And this is where there's an agreement to operate a park or public space kind of on behalf of the city, while remaining, of course, accountable in things like decision making. And these groups may be entirely self-funded, or they may be expected to be self-funded eventually. And so understanding kind of the revenue model of these spaces is important. They don't work in every space, obviously. And a good example of this is the Bentway in Toronto. And I know Alana from the Bentway, I saw her join the webinar, so she's on right now. She's the co-executive director. This is a public space underneath the Gardiner Expressway in Toronto, as you can see from the photo there. It was created with a $25 million philanthropic donation. And to realize the kind of programming goals and the sort of arts and culture needs and the specialized, sort of operations of a space like this, a very unique space, the creation of a new independent nonprofit was approved by City Council. And the Bentway now operates the site. They run programming, they do community engagement and fundraising through things like grants and sponsorships and donations. And they also get some revenue through like sort of permitting and events and things like that.
And just wanted to highlight another sole manager model. And similar to what Jake mentioned, we've got some extra materials on the Assiniboine Park Conservancy on our website as well. And I think we'll post some links around that too. But this is the only other park conservancy in Canada. It's the very first. It's a very robust kind of partnership. It's about Assiniboine Park in Winnipeg. It's one of the crown jewels of Winnipeg's park system. It's about 400 acres large. Has many amenities like a zoo and a conservatory. But by 2008, these amenities were in very rough shape. and the city did not have the funds to fix them up. And a local philanthropist came forward and approached the mayor with a proposal to create a standalone nonprofit. So it was established in 2008, 2009, and the Conservancy essentially runs all aspects of the park, including concessions. It's raised, well over $100 million for the park. They do all the programming. They revitalize the zoo, many of the structures, and they provide, all the types of programming for the park too. So, we've covered a lot here, and it's a lot of high-level things, a lot of generalities, but really wanted to focus us in on 5 key sort of takeaway points coming out of the conversation today. So, and again, really want to emphasize this point about that the key opportunity is around connections to community and engaging the energy of local volunteers. And sort of, again, we mentioned this, building this constituency for parks in the city. Yes, partnerships can lead to new fundraising opportunities, but if city park departments go into partnerships really only looking for money, you're really missing part of the big opportunity, and you're not going to create the sort of long-term sustainability for these partnerships. And furthermore, many funders are more interested in supporting and writing a check to a nonprofit partner with the city rather than to the city directly. So again, just focus, it's community engagement that's the real opportunity here, and the other parts are things that come out of engaging the community in new and different ways. As we discussed with US examples, it's absolutely critical that partnerships enhance core government operations, maintenance, and funding, not replace. It's a fine line, and we struggle with where that line is all the time. I know Gil Pendelosa was on the chat room earlier. He's been a great proponent of, like, we've got to, partnerships can't replace what government's doing. We fully agree with that. Don't want to end up what's happened in the US. And lastly, there's many great Canadian US partnership examples that we've discussed today, but every city's different, every community and park is different, and trying to take, like, a model from X jurisdiction and apply it over to your city or to this particular park in this particular neighborhood in a cookie cutter kind of model. If you take the wrong model and put it in the wrong place at the wrong time, it's just not going to end well for anybody. And just before, we've got lots of time for some questions. Just want to make sure that everyone's aware of the next webinar that we're going to be doing around partnerships. We're going to go into a bit of a deeper dive on some of the details of how you best ideas for moving forward on some of these particular models that we've discussed here.
And yeah, of course, we're here to help and provide expertise and help sort of implementing these models at these different scales in your own specific contexts. And so that might be setting up a Park Friends group, a network, or looking at some sort of partnership plan for a particular park. We've done this before at each of these scales, including work in Toronto on projects like the Bentway and Friends of Allen Gardens, for instance, and also some work in Montreal. And the important thing here is that, we're really focusing on kind of this made in Canada experience across the country, rather than relying on models in the US, which, as Dave mentioned, kind of operate on a much different, under much different circumstances and in much different context. So we can draw really here on the great network that we have in Canada, like all of you, partners and funders and community groups and city staff across the country. All right, so now, yeah, we've got a good amount of time left for questions, which is nice. So, Dave, did you want to, where's the, I'm trying to find, okay. Did you want to add anything to that question that Gil asked, sort of making sure that the public sector doesn't reduce budgets in proportion to private funds received, and that kind of two-tiered question around partnerships?
It's not a simple one, yeah. So it's, again, I think the good part is, again, a lot of park people works with a lot of funders, and we work together to try to facilitate some of that funding going into parks. And it's helpful because many of the funders, their first question is like, are we replacing what the city should be funding? Are we bringing something new in? It's a tough, fine line. So, and again, I think it's, we have to be pushing our political people all the time about that partnerships aren't replacing what the city's doing. They're adding to it. And I think, you've noticed a lot today, it's things like programming. It's stuff that essentially the city, in some cases, used to do decades ago, but they've sort of gotten out of that business. So it's adding in new ideas and new things to the city. Again, things like, we talked about the Betway model in Toronto. It's bringing exciting arts programming, things like that to a new and different kind of space, rather than taking an existing park and picking up the garbage because the city wasn't doing the proper job that it should be doing with it. It's a constant struggle, and you have to be very vigilant around it.
I think we've seen too partnerships developing in all sorts of different neighborhoods in cities across Canada. It's not solely focused on kind of the sort of jewel parks in downtowns. There's lots of really amazing partnerships that are happening in many different communities across cities across Canada. So it's not always about those destination sort of downtown parks getting all of the sort of partnership focus. Okay. Just sort of going. So Michelle Gay had one here. I'm just trying to get to ones that were asked in that last session. She said, riffing on Mary Catherine's question about community group involvement, do you have any advice, frameworks, or models that can help with governance? I think this is something that we are probably going to be going into more deeply in the second webinar, but and perhaps Steph or Rachel can drop this into the chat window. We do have resources already developed on our website that specifically for Park Friends Group and kind of the community group model on how to set up a group, how to engage the surrounding community. There's lots of resources on our website that kind of get into that question around kind of frameworks or models. But I would also encourage you to join us on the second webinar, where we'll get more into like the deep dive discussion about sort of the tools and frameworks to set up these different types of partnerships.
Well, and just one last comment on that too. Just again, mentioned this earlier about the US generally being more formalized. They have like legal contracts they do often with Park Friends groups, things like that. So in our experience, it's trying for cities and others to be as supportive as they can and recognize these are informal, these are volunteers, they can often be a small group of people. So trying to embrace that creativity in different ways and ways to support them versus trying to, force people into different structures and getting overly caught up with governance when you're really just trying to spark some energy and engagement and volunteerism in the neighborhood.
So Keith brings up the fun question about insurance in parks. And he says, have you experienced insurance being a deterrent to neighborhood groups using a park? We need to have liability insurance in order to organize anything in the park. And yes, Keith, that is a huge issue in cities right across the country, and one that we were working hard on here in Toronto. I think there are some examples where there's a new stewardship plan, I believe, that the City of Vancouver is working on, not within parks, but within their kind of plaza program. So it's their streets and engineering department. And in order to promote the use of those new plazas, which are kind of created out of street space in different neighborhoods that need open space, they've, I believe, reduced kind of the permit burden of those spaces. And one of the ways that they, I think, are looking to do that is to cover the insurance of those groups through like kind of the city's own insurance policy in order to reduce the burden of using those spaces. But we've seen cities across the country waive permit fees in order to encourage the community use of parks, but much more reticent to kind of waive insurance requirements because of kind of risk liability within cities. It's a big sticking point.
Yeah, and it brings up a bit of the issue about supporting community engagement and partnerships and these kind of Park Friends groups in underserviced and lower income neighborhoods, where sometimes it's not that much money, but it actually can be a real deterrent to those groups. So it's really trying to recognize how some small little barriers could make big differences in some of these underserviced neighborhoods, and so. And it's many of those groups in those neighborhoods that make a huge difference. So if sometimes city resources are limited and they're trying to support some of these community groups, putting that little extra effort into underserviced neighborhoods can have a really big return.
Great. So Naomi at the top here has a question. She asked, if we can talk about the tensions that arise when a park gets developed as a result of a private for-profit development, like a condo project. She says the park is a concession to the city, but all too often is not necessarily developed in a way that really augments or enhances public space. What are the ways for municipalities to ensure that these arrangements with developers serve the public interests? And I'm not sure if here you're talking about the development of public parks or the development of usually what are called POPs, or privately owned public spaces. Those are the ones that are often developed through the development process, like little plazas and courtyards that are privately owned but are maintained for public access. And those can have a host of issues. They're sort of not able to be used as a normal park in terms of permitting usually. Sometimes they'll have like private security and things like that. So absolutely that is a concern. I think, cities that are really rely on those spaces to create some open space in very dense urban environments like downtown Toronto, for instance, they've actually released guidelines on their website for the development of POPs. And these really get at things like access, and ensuring certain kind of amenities in that space. Oh, I see you've said that you're actually talking about public parks. So I still think it's an interesting resource for people to check out on the City of Toronto's website, the privately owned public spaces, because it does kind of pertain to some of what we're talking about here. So she says, yes, I'm talking about public parks. The developer develops it in return for the development approval, but then turns it over to the city for management. In Vancouver, we have this. Yeah, I think really this is about the community engagement process for that park, and trying to get involved. Even when a developer is building a park for a city, there's still a community engagement process that needs to happen for those spaces. So really, I think that's like where your avenue lies for kind of getting involved there.
Yeah, and it's really up to the city as part of that process. That's part of their negotiations with the developer. The same thing happens certainly in Toronto and other Canadian cities too, that some cases the developer is providing funds or whatever, and then the city does the project, and other times the developer does the project and hands it over to the city. And sometimes it's resulted in a good city. I know in a couple of cases in Toronto, the city Parks Department hasn't been satisfied with what the developer has done in the end, and it's led to some fights over that. But again, the city was sticking up for what they had believed was needed and pushed back on the developer.
So Anna, let me just get back to this. Anna asks, what should a friends group or a park consider when thinking about applying for being a charitable organization versus a nonprofit, or even if you need to incorporate as a nonprofit at all? I think that's the other question, right? Dave, I don't know if you have any thoughts about kind of.
Sure. And again, we've got some very good resources on our website around this. It's certainly a number of park groups ask about this, and our advice is, particularly for new groups, like, keep it simple. Becoming a nonprofit is not actually that complicated, but it still takes some work. And but charitable is very, very complicated. It takes a lot of legal expertise and time. And so our strong advice, like, you don't need to incorporate in any way, shape, or form to do a bank account to start things going. So we strongly encourage people to keep it very simple. And I think, even across Canada, in terms of community park groups that are charities, it's just a small handful. And generally, you don't need to be it. Certainly, like with Park People, we keep our grants to groups very informal so that you don't have to be incorporated or become a charity. Groups can partner with other trustees to if they're trying to get other charitable grants. So our strong advice usually most of the time is keep it simple, but we've got some great resources you can read on our website too.
Jeff asks sort of a similar question, I think, to maybe Gil's question. If there's models that don't result in large service level discrepancies with surrounding parks, many councils are reluctant to explore this model for fear of creating have and have not parks within their municipalities. I don't know if we have anything more to add to that than sort of what we talked about before in terms of, really making it important that partnerships are about, additional services and not replacing or used as an opportunity to replace sort of core government funding to parks.
Yeah, and in some US cities, you've seen, and again, we only have 2 conservancies in Canada, so hasn't been an issue here, and we certainly hope it never ever becomes one. But in the US, you've seen some conservancies that are of a larger scale. So in Pittsburgh, the Park Conservancy manages a whole, they range about 7 or 8 parks. Fairmont Park Conservancy in Philadelphia is 6 or 7 parks, often in underserviced neighborhoods. North Brooklyn Park Alliance manages a whole range. So they've sort of taken a conservancy model for a range of neighborhood parks, so it doesn't become one park benefits and other parks fail. But again, those are stepping in where cities have basically abandoned parks, and we're not advocating that as a partnership solution for Canada.
All right, let's see. These are great questions. I'm just kind of taking a look, scroll down here to see if we didn't miss anyone here. There were some questions, sort of similar questions that were asked that we talked about around insurance requirements and when to become sort of like a charity or a nonprofit. So let me just see if we can find a different one here.
There is the Michael one at the top. The one.
Oh, okay. If a nonprofit brings funding into a city parks project, what level of input should the nonprofit expect?
Do you want me to, or?
Sure.
That's again, we're going to get more into this into the next webinar as some of the more key elements around it. But the most important thing in it, and it's the core element of all partnerships, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next webinar, is about mutual understanding of what each partner is getting out of it. And so you can't go into these partnerships. And again, with Park Friends groups, it's more informal, but as you get into these more formalized relationships, where they can really go wrong is that, one partner is expecting A, B, and C, and the other partner doesn't necessarily agree with it. So it's about having, really good discussions up front, and with both partners being willing to walk away from it if they don't get those, things that both sides are looking from it early on.
I would add too that it's, as I mentioned, it's kind of like you take sort of like a strengths-based approach with partnerships. And so really kind of understanding where you as a nonprofit or a community group, have certain strengths, and where a city partner has certain strengths, and how together you can kind of, sort of bolster both of each other's strengths. So that can be sort of part of that discussion about what a nonprofit can kind of bring to the table. Catherine Falk has one that says, for more specific partnerships, stewardship models, do you have suggestions for ways municipalities to support groups regarding OHS regulations? Who would be the responsible governing body? I'm not, you might have to just, Catherine, put in there what that acronym is.
Oh, occupational health and safety.
Got it, okay.
So that would be city, OHS. Yeah, so I think it's and then I think Christine responded to that too. So it is all related. So I'm sorry, and then the question disappeared there. I was trying to, but
it's just one. It should be the second one down still. Who would be the responsible governing body for specific partnerships to support around OHS regulations?
A governing body issue. So if this is related to, the rules that the city has to follow, and again, if the city is going into any kind of arrangement with different partners, those partners have to follow the city rules. So I think it's about just carefully following those rules, and there should be, again, ways to make those still work. It's part of that delicate balance needed, but I think, you know, again, that's, yeah.
All right. Howard, oh, just moving around here. Okay. Howard has a question here. He says, I'm currently putting together a business case for a partnership coordinator position. Great. Would you happen to know, for example, how many resources are designated in Montreal for coordinating their park partnerships or typical for Canadian municipalities? I don't know in terms of like a staff perspective. I think a lot of the time, from what I've seen, like this is a more underdeveloped sort of staffing area within cities, or the partnership unit might be kind of a super unit that sits outside of a parks department and looks at different types of partnerships for the city. I'm not sure exactly in Montreal or some of those Quebec cities, like how the staffing works in terms of how many people they have assigned to working on those projects. Dave, do you have any knowledge of that?
Not exactly, but Howard, what would be helpful? There's going to be a contact us element on the webinar here. So send us an email and we can connect you up with some other folks.
For sure.
And I think it actually could be interesting. Again, this is what Park People tries to do is try to network different people and connect different people doing this kind of work. So we might be able to connect you up with some other people around Canada doing that work. And it'd be a great thing. You know, we've certainly got some contacts with different cities around some of that, and it would be yeah, great to connect you up with some of those.
So given the time here, and we just got a few sort of last slides to wrap things up, but just wanted to say thanks so much for your thoughtful questions and for taking the time out of your afternoon to come watch the webinar here. And I think some of the questions that you asked here will also go into deeper in the webinar that we're doing next month, which will be Dave and Natalie Brown, another colleague of ours at Park People. And so that'll get into more of the details, I think, about how to set up a lot of these partnerships.
Great. Yeah, thanks. We've got all the questions still. So if you have further questions that need answering, don't hesitate to get in touch with us. Just to close up, we shared and mentioned a lot of the great resources available on our website for organizational planning, or how-to guides for animating parks or holding activities advance, and as well as case studies and research papers. So be sure to check that out and reach out at any point along the way. We're here to help. We also have a newsletter that you can subscribe to access upcoming opportunities, resources, and events, and keep you connected to the park issues that you care about. And we've recently launched a fully bilingual national Facebook group that connects members of the network all across the country. And yes, just be sure to keep in touch. A small survey will pop up when you leave the webinar. We would love to hear your feedback and how everything went today. Thanks again to Jake, Dave, and Steph, and everybody else for being on the line here. And thanks for your ongoing care and commitment for your parks and communities. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.